I've been to the moon twice. No, not really. um, you know, so I've been a bookbinder for, book artist for almost 40 years now. But before that, I was a chemist, as you mentioned, a chemist. I fell in love with chemistry as a little kid, and it showed me a way of interpreting the physical environment and connecting to the physical environment that I carried over into my book arts. And the thing that really grabbed me for chemistry when I was a kid was that I was trying to make perfume. You know, a 12-year-old boy making perfume, it's just whatever smells, right? So I went around the house. I had a lab in the basement. My dad was a professional photographer, and he had his portrait studio in the basement. And so I used to love watching him develop black and white photographs. It was like magic to be in the darkroom and see that image develop on that white piece of paper. So I fell in love with chemistry and paper at that point and put up my lab in the laundry room right next to his dark room. One day I put together all the smelly stuff I could find, which included Clorox bleach, good perfume material, and muriatic acid that I had gotten from the hardware store. Well, you get a big cloud of chlorine gas, and I filled the basement with chlorine gas, and I filled my lungs with chlorine gas. And I walked outside around the block for a couple of times to try to get my breath back. And when I came back to the house, two important things happened. My dad kicked me in the studio or in the lab out of the house, but I went down to a friend's basement and his mom would buy his chemicals, so it was even better. Um, but a friend of my dad sat down with me and we wrote out the equation for the reaction that occurred to produce chlorine gas. And there I saw that reaction written on paper, and I had still had the feeling of the gas in my lungs. So there was a mind-body connection that was made through that experience. And that mind body experience is what I try to do in my book work. It's not just about text, it's not just about imagery. It integrates the binding into the narrative of whatever story is being told by that book object. And so that all started when I fell in love with chemistry, and I went on to teach chemistry, study chemistry, and teach chemistry at the University of Minnesota. And then one day I just felt like I was way too far up into my head, and I really needed to get back down into my body and make stuff the way that I used to as a kid. So I looked around for something to do, and I collected books. I love books. I started. I taught chemistry, but I ended up with a degree in philosophy and would sit in my walk-in closet covered with books during the Minnesota winter when it was 40 below outside. And I felt like Faust. The library, the books were insulating me from the cold, and it was really great. But after graduating, or when I finally did graduate with a degree in philosophy, I ran away from words. I felt words are too cheap. I could, pretty successfully argue any philosophical point, and anybody can if you really work at it. And that just felt like there was a disconnection. Um, so that light that went on in my head at that point, well, there were a couple of things. My philosophy partner, Catherine, kicked me in the shin really hard one day while I was espousing the belief that only the intellect gives us important information. And that kick in the shin brought me back into my body. And I thought, I got to use my body more. So I went right from the chemistry and philosophy departments at the university to the library binder on campus and started making library bindings because I loved books. I just loved books. But I ran away from words. So what do I run away to? I run away to making books, which is kind of ironic. I guess I didn't want to go too far from books or from words, but you'll see in my later work with wire edge binding, I often don't even put words into the structures because I hand them to someone and they play with them, and because it's interactive, the way that a child's toy is, they'll play with it for a while. There'll be a mind body connection, and they start telling their own stories. So I look at them, some of them, as devices for people to discover their own narratives, their own stories.
Could you take us back to that moment when you just started to evolve your style? I mean, I assume you started by learning the basics, and
Yes.
then you transited into the more artistic, the more
Right.
philosophical thing. Who was a major influence on you, or was it just you yourself? Who influenced you?
Well, learning bookbinding, I mean, I came out of chemistry and science. I loved chemistry. So uh, when I left school and got the job binding books, I stayed at the library bindery for 3 months, I think. And the shop manager there showed me an article about a bindery in Massachusetts, in Boston, Harcourt Bindery, and they had a school there for traditional book arts or book binding. And also, it was, it had been founded in 1900. It used all the traditional leather and gold techniques. And so, coming out of science and not having an art background, I worked on the job. I learned stuff in the library bindery, even though I didn't stay there very long at Harcourt. I took classes in leather binding, but then I also was given the job or offered the job, which I took, of finisher and edge gilder. So I got to chase gold leaf around. But it was all learning the technique. And, the edge gilder that had been at Harcourt for years and years had retired. And Sam Allenport and Joe Newman, Sam owns Harcourt, had tried to reestablish what that gilder had done. All the material was there, but he wouldn't tell anybody. He was so secretive that he just wouldn't share the information. So we had to reinvent it. So that was perfect for me because I'm an experimenter. So I looked at what materials and I changed the materials somewhat, but recreating, kind of reverse engineering, looking at the materials that were used to make the or to do the edge gilding. But there was an edge gilder who had been there since World War II. So, or not an edge gilder, but a finisher. So Woody had a lot of experience. But so here I am doing all of these traditional structures. And I think that that's the way to start. Learn the traditional, learn the materials, look at what's been going on forever, but then realize that none of that stuff, I mean, someone made that stuff up, every bit of it at some point. So as long as you do a good job, you can make up new stuff yourself. And, um, at Harcourt, I was learning traditional stuff. Then I went to the western part of Massachusetts, about 100 miles uh, west of Boston, to work with David Bourbeau at Thistle Bindery. And it was a hand bindery, and it was doing editions of small editions and one-offs with the local artists here in the western part of the state. So what I did was work with David for a while. Then I started my own shop, and I collaborated with the local book artists. And at that point, there was Barry Moser at Pennyroyal Press, Alan James Robinson at Chalonadai Press, Carol Blinn at Warwick Press, and a number of others in the valley here. And in the building that I'm still in, this whole factory building, there were, I think, at least 7 binderies, a paper maker, a paper marbler, um, and then nearby, great letterpress printers. Well, Carol Blinn is a good letterpress printer too, but nearby, some really great, Dan Kelleher at Wild Carrot Letterpress, Art Larson at Horton Tank Graphics, and then many others a little bit farther out. So it was a hotbed of book arts to move into. And I was so lucky. I was the first bookbinder, though, that in the valley when I moved out here that hadn't been trained by Arno Werner, who was a German trained bookbinder who came to the States right at the beginning of World War II and set up his shop. There were three groups or couples or an individual that came from Germany. It was the Gerlachs who went up to New Hampshire, and then Arno Werner was out here, and then the Eberhards, who went to Philadelphia. So they were the early teachers too. And when I moved to the Valley, all of these other people who were already here and established had all studied either with Arno, the German technique, or with one of Arno's students. So it was really interesting. I mean, I did things very differently because I learned a lot at Harcourt and at, another bindery that I worked at. But because I'm an experimenter, I just make stuff up. So I learned, I continue to study leather binding, gold tooling, edge gilding. Well, not so much edge gilding anymore, but the others, and really love those old techniques.